Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone across the globe joining us today. This is Bridget from Acquia. Today's webinar is Through the Eyes of All Users, How to Achieve Website Accessibility for Everyone, with Kevin Roddy from Siteimprove, Nelson Harris from Palantir, and Laura McDaniel from North Dakota State University, and David Aponovich from Acquia. Just a couple housekeeping items before we get started. If you have any audio issues, please send them in the Q&A tab and I will assist you. If you have any questions for the presenters, please submit them in the Q&A tab as well, and they will answer them at the end of the presentation. Slides and the recording of this webinar will be posted to acquia.com and also sent to you via email within the next few days. Without further ado, I will pass it over to David.
Excellent, and thank you very much. And thanks everyone for joining in today for this, what we think is a very important and timely topic, Through the Eyes of All Users, How to Achieve Website Accessibility for Everyone. This webinar is really meant to help organizations, and many of you in higher education, but others too, better understand web accessibility concepts and what can be done to make content and sites more accessible. And by everyone, we really do mean everyone. Did you know about 1 in 4 people in the U.S. live with a disability of some kind? It's a very interesting data point. And with data like that, it really makes it incredibly important and a responsibility to organizations to ensure accessibility to all your visitors when building or modifying a website. We're going to hear from a great success story, the story of North Dakota State University, a 15,000 student university in Fargo, North Dakota, which, by the way, is today, according to USA Today, the 3rd coldest spot in the USA at 19 below zero. They have done some great work with the partners that are on this call, Siteimprove and Palantir, working to make their site more accessible to all users with their Drupal site on Acquia Cloud. So let me turn to our guests today. We'll speak with Kevin Roddy, with Nelson Harris, with Laura McDaniel from NDSU. So let's turn to them and let's get going. Actually, first I'll talk about Acquia for one moment. Acquia is a leading provider of cloud-based, data-driven journey technology. We're building on Drupal to help organizations build, manage, and activate digital experiences at scale. We're based in Boston, but we're a global organization. We have over 3,000 customers, many of them, literally hundreds of higher education, many of whom are on this call today, as well as large B2B and B2C organizations that are participating on our platform to build, manage, and deliver great customer experiences through digital channels. With that, I'll move on. I'll let our guests move on, introduce themselves and their companies.
Yeah, thanks, David. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us. A bit about Siteimprove. We're all about taking a holistic approach to monitoring, maintaining, optimizing, and measuring your digital assets. We are Acquia and Palantir partners. We too have a global reach and are headquartered out of Copenhagen, Denmark. And while we provide many solutions for optimization, inclusion, and accessibility is at the core of what we do. I'll pass it off to Nelson.
Hey everyone, I'm Nelson Harris. I'm the sales manager at Palantir.net. Palantir.net is an implementation partner. We're a strategic partner, a website design and development agency that's actually based out of Evanston, Illinois. We're a remote company, so luckily I am not in the middle of the polar vortex at the moment. I'm actually in sunny Denver at the moment. We're about 34 employees strong. We've been around since the mid-90s and have been doing Drupal development for a long, long time as well. We're an Acquia partner and have Acquia certified developers on staff and work very closely with Siteimprove. Our mission is to help organizations that are purpose-driven. We try to strengthen humanity through the work that we do, helping others discover, create, and share knowledge. We work a lot with folks in the healthcare space, nonprofits, government, and then of course higher education, which is something that we're going to talk about today. So with that, One last introduction, certainly not least, but this webinar is going to be a bit of a case study walkthrough with some specific examples of a client that we all mutually share, Acquia, Siteimprove, and Palantir. That client is North Dakota Sate University, and our point of contact and client there, Laura, has been kind enough to join us for this webinar and will be able to answer your questions and share some from her perspective, as I'm sure many of you come from the higher ed side of things and are interested in seeing how this applies to you. But just a quick introduction to North Dakota State as a university. As David said, they have about 15,000 students. They're a public research university based out of Fargo, and they're one of the top 100 public research universities in the US for the agricultural sciences, psychology, and social sciences. They're very focused on STEM. And Laura made sure to asked me to mention that they were recently featured in the news because their football team, the Bison, won their 7th national championship, which is more than Alabama, I'll have you know. So with that, let's jump in a little bit more on sort of laying the groundwork of this situation. So when North Dakota State reached out to Palantir, they were going through a redesign of their website, and they were looking for someone as a partner to help them with a site build that was already in progress that they were completing, and they really were looking for somebody to bring a fresh perspective on accessibility, bring an expertise there to help them identify what issues might exist and help them build a scalable platform that's easy to continue to allow to be accessible once it launches. So as Palantir, one of the main things that we did to help was use Siteimprove's tools to conduct a site audit that really focused around accessibility and identify the issues that there are, and then maintain them, make sure that once they were fixed, they stayed fixed, and verify that they were fixed. So with that, I'm going to pass it again back to Kevin to just talk a little bit about how accessibility is important and how Siteimprove kind of adds to that.
Yeah, thanks, Nelson. In providing a real-life example, when you think about building a new office space or place of public accommodation, contractors know to build with accessibility in mind. Think about the elevators, wheelchair ramps, and automatic doors. Now think about how often you use that elevator or that automatic door. Accessibility just doesn't improve the experience for just disabled users, it improves for all users. And you need to take that same approach with your digital assets. So what is web accessibility? Plain and simple, it's about creating an equal experience for all users, abled or disabled. A few examples being providing captions for users with hearing loss or someone who cannot see well using a screen reader. The W3C provides standards to help make the web accessible. Most well known is WCAG, or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is a set of standards that aids developers, designers, and editors with best practices in accessible design. There are 4 core principles of the WCAG, or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. First being perceivable. Can everyone see this? Provide captions, text alternatives so people can see or hear the content. Secondly, operable. Can everyone use this? Help users navigate and find content. An example being, can users navigate via keyboard only? Thirdly, understandable. Can everyone understand this? You need to make your content readable, understandable, by providing text that is clear and uses simple language. And lastly, robust. Can all devices use this? You need to maximize your compatibility with assistive technologies. Basically, provide good, clean code. And getting really into the importance of accessibility, as David had mentioned, approximately 1 in 4 users have some form of disability that could impact their experience on the web. And when you think about the web, it's really an essential part of life for many individuals when you think about life at work and even at home. Building an accessible website is more than simply helping those users. Accessible design is good design. it improves your SEO, and makes the experience for your average user better. There is a trade-off, and Nelson will get a bit more into that later.
All right, so we all know accessibility is super important. I know that if you're on this webinar, that's probably self-explanatory. I want to walk you through some of the things that Palantir looks for when we take on any website project, but especially an audit, and especially when it has to do specifically with website accessibility. And so the way that we break down our approach and sort of begin to categorize these things is into three main areas. And the first of those is content. So a lot of these things, as you'll probably come to find a theme of as we go through this webinar, a lot of these things are pretty intuitive. If it's a good idea, it's probably a good idea for accessibility, and those things really play into each other. So the first of that is kind of that obvious one of clear and concise language, which is just good no matter what you're doing, but especially for accessibility. So when it comes to content, we just want it to be short. We want it to be explanatory. That's, again, good for anyone, but especially for a screen reader, as somebody who might be going through who's non-sighted, is getting the screen read to them. It's better if the content is quickly understandable to them and read in a way that they know exactly what they're about to do on the website, and action that they're about to take. Image, alt text, and titles are super important for the same reason. So as people are browsing through the site with a screen reader, that information is going to be relayed to them via their computer reading it to them. So we should be describing our images in the title themselves. So while everybody loves the classic img001.jpg, and it may roll off the tongue, it doesn't really explain in a clear and concise way what kind of image we're trying to show on the screen. And we also try, whenever possible, and we'll get into this a little later about kind of how we build, but when we're working with Drupal on Acquia's platform, we try to build into the CMS and into the content authorship experience ways for that to be easy and to remind users to do it, as opposed to having to take a step out of their workflow and make sure that they're adhering to these guidelines. So we try to put guardrails around these things as much as possible as we go through. Next, you want to make sure that you're including meta tags and that they make sense. So provide context and name your links based on what content they link to. I mean, all these things just play into each other, just like images. You want to name what you're linking to so people know what they're about to click on. So don't do anything that says click here. Let's leave that in the 90s where it belongs. All right, so next avenue of looking at our audit is design. So in this case, we're looking at things like color and contrast. So the first thing is make sure that for low vision users or for colorblind users, there's a certain level of contrast that we need to achieve between the background image and something that's color that's contrasting that image, so that the text is easy to read. And again, for colorblind users, you need to make sure that these, the contrast between different colors makes sense and is easy to view. And those are all guidelines that's written into the WCAG standard. Next, we want a consistent experience when it comes to navigation. So as you are using a keyboard, as Kevin described, to browse through a website, you want to make sure that when you're navigating through that website and you're going through the nav that you can see at the top in this image here on the right, that every interaction that you're having with that nav is the same across every page and across every context, so that you don't get lost as you're going through, because that's very important. Once somebody who is non-sighted or low vision has actually figured out the way to navigate through your website, you don't want to discourage them by changing it all up on them in the middle of their browsing experience. Next, let's make sure that our design is responsive across all devices. So again, that really plays into consistency. As you're browsing on mobile, it should be consistent in the same way that it was on desktop, or if it's scaling to different breakpoints, because a non-sighted user won't necessarily be able to obviously see the changes that are happening there. So that needs to be consistent. And then obviously, again, a super obvious and intuitive one, clear layout and organization, which is important, again, for consistency all across, and including your nav and everything like that. Finally, we look at development. So there are there's a checklist, obviously, that we go through for the WCAG guidelines to make sure from a development perspective that we're not missing anything. So we identify with the client up front, are we trying to go AA, are we AAA, are we single A, what level of compliance are we looking for? And that's where in this sort of phase we're checking that everything is according to that guideline. Next, we want to look at URL structure. So same thing with images and same thing with content. Make it intuitive, make it describe what you're actually pointing to. So unlike links, where that's something you're clicking on, but this is like actually the URL that's in your browser bar. You want it to, unlike, I don't know if you can see my current URL of this presentation, but this is a bunch of gobbledygook of numbers and letters that it auto-generated. If you're building out a URL structure in your site, you want it to say, if it's about your about page, you want it to say about. You want to make sure that you're explaining in your URL structure what things are pointing to. Next, we're looking at semantic markup, which basically just means that when you're looking at the HTML markup elements of your page, that all of the markup is being used appropriately for the way that it was meant to be used in the right hierarchy. So a common offender that people run into a lot and do is when you're using a heading tag, an H1 tag, H2 tag, H3 tag, those things in that number order is a hierarchy that should be followed for a lot of reasons, for accessibility reasons, for SEO reasons, and sometimes people, just because of the styling in the CSS, may put an H1 tag below an H2 tag in the hierarchy just because the H2 tag looks bigger or something along those lines. We want to make sure that that isn't happening in the markup. I heard recently one of our solution architects here at Palantir told me an anecdote about a lot earlier on in his career when he was working with a website that he came across that was using a UL tag, so an unordered list tag that basically generates bullets on the front end of the website. But it was actually styled in the CSS to show the bullets as numbers, which there's a tag for that. It's called the OL tag, which is an ordered list tag. So this is an example of something that we don't want to do from the perspective of accessibility, SEO, all of those things, and just web best practices in general. Next, we want to look at alt text. So we try to make sure that there's a requirement of alt text input on the admin side, on the Drupal side, when we're putting in images. And if that's not there, we try to make sure that we implement that in the future. And then we want to review with the team the editorial workflows that are in place. So both from the perspective of on the CMS side and really more on the technical side, like what is the approval, how does this work? But also from sort of the organizational side, is who is approving posts, who has the ability, the permission to publish something, and is there somebody that's in charge of making sure that all these things are meeting a standard, and so that you can have that consistency throughout. So Siteimprove's tools, as I mentioned, really help us do all of these things, check all of these things. So I'm going to pass it once again to Kevin just to talk through a little bit about how Siteimprove helped, how the dashboard sort of works, and what Siteimprove aims to do.
Yeah, thanks, Nelson. Siteimprove is a SaaS-based solution. So weekly, we will scan your site and report back to you. We do the content deep dive and auditing to ensure the continued framework is compliant after the site is launched. But the platform's highly customizable, and we can prioritize issues based on a number of factors: number of errors, page levels, page views, and clicks on a specific page. Lastly, and most importantly, we provide ongoing measuring and performance to ensure you maintain a level of compliance over time.
All right, so the moment that you probably have all been waiting for, let's get into some specific examples. I always like to, when we're talking about technical concepts, take a look at what we really did, what really changed, so that you can have an idea of how maybe this stuff can apply to your own website. So when we performed the audit as Palantir, we worked with NDSU to meet 2.0 guidelines at the time. And then a lot of what we focused on was prioritizing and balancing. So it is about, it's a trade-off when you're working with accessibility. There are a lot of things that you might want to do from a design perspective or from a brand perspective that that look aesthetically good on the website or meet some internal goal or requirement, and they may be in conflict with some of the guidelines. And so it's about a balance. It's about figuring out what is the most important thing and what are the trade-offs that can be made to meet accessibility without doing something that isn't to the priority of the organization. So that's kind of what we looked at here. But so let's look at some examples. So first, I mentioned color contrast in our design portion of our auditing, and at this stage, we came to find this example that you see here on the left in this image, where this was on a lot of landing pages. There's this beautiful banner that shows, in some cases, an image of the campus or an image of students interacting with each other. And it's a really awesome way to showcase what NDSU has to offer. And yet we had some contrast issues with the way that the text was being displayed. So AA accessibility requires that there's a contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1 for normal text and 3 to 1 for large text. So as you can see here, I know the image is maybe a little small, but the commit to NDSU title, it's fairly legible. The lower part with the description, the subtext there, is a little bit less legible just based on the busyness of the background. So we were trying to come up with a creative solution to meet the requirement without saying, hey, you can't have cool banners of your campus, right? Because we want to showcase that stuff. And so what we did is we found this solution, which is what's live on the site now. There's a box here that uses the NDSU brand color, and we're able to control for that contrast ratio just by having the opacity of the color be a certain amount, so that every time they're putting a title on over a hero image, that title is meeting the standard and is still showcasing everything that the university has to offer and being part of the design. And that actually helps enhance some of that branding and reinforce that with that NDSU green that we all love. So here's another example of color contrast. This is a quick one, but as you use your keyboard to navigate through a website, I don't know how many of you have ever tried this, but if you even do a quick Google search right now and you press tab to move through the website and move through the different choices of things to select, you'll see this skip to main content appear up in the top left corner. And what this does is it allows folks who are using a keyboard to navigate through a website to just jump right to the navigation, so that they don't have to go through any other links like a search bar or things like that might be up in the header. And so it's really important that this has a good level of contrast. And the reason for that is because if you're someone who's low sighted, you may have some level of sight, but you don't have you don't have full sight. Being able to find that and see that there's actually that skip to main content is really important, so that you know where you are in your tabbing through. And so what we wanted to do here was just darken this a little bit. It's a little light gray against a white background. So we did that. It was a pretty quick fix, but this was really important because that skip to main content is there for visually impaired users. So speaking of tabbing, something else we noticed was around tabbing through the navigation of the website itself. So after you've done that skip to main content, you're actually on the nav. You can see in this photo, I don't know if you can make it out, but right around that grad school drop-down menu, there's a little dancing ants, as I call it. I don't know what a normal person calls that, but it's a marquee around it that shows that you're on that level, that you're on that step in the navigation. And what should happen here is there should be a sub-nav that's rolling down, which is what would happen if you moused over it. But since we're tabbing through, for some reason there was a bug on the site that wasn't creating that roll down into the sub-nav. So what we did here is we helped with changing some of the JavaScript and CSS to make sure that does happen, so that you can see where you are. Now, interestingly, when people do tab through this, if you're using a screen reader and you're not sighted, it would read back to you the sub-nav elements, which would be fine. But if you are partially sighted, and again, similar to the skip to main content section, you're going to get lost where you are, because you are expecting something to roll down, but you're not actually seeing anything roll down, and the screen reader might be reading you something that you don't know where it is. So we helped solve for this problem. Something else just to mention here too is that in some cases we want to look at the actual hierarchy of the navigation. In this case, when we audited the site, the hierarchy and the ordering was fine. But for some folks on their site, you may have a subnav from a main navigation that needs to be relooked at from an information architecture and organizational standpoint to make sense for that consistency of experience. So this is a really fast GIF, and I apologize for that, but hopefully we can loop through it a few times so that you can catch it. But this is just me tabbing through the website and landing on admission, and you can see when I actually do land on that admission, you can follow the little box all the way through to the different elements of the subnav there. So that's how we fixed that. All right, so then on more of the development side, on more of the Drupal side, the content management side and the admin side, we looked at these callouts. So you've got a title and you've got some subtext and then you have a CTA. And this was happening in a lot of places on the site, an important part of the site to get students or prospective students or their parents to take action and get people to actually come and visit the campus. And so what was currently happening when we did the audit is that a lot of this stuff was being handled inside of a WYSIWYG editor. So you can see in this screenshot that this is what it looked like, where you actually are managing the organization of the content and some of these elements within the WYSIWYG editor and using HTML to kind of organize these things. And that's fine. And there actually there's still parts of the site that do it this way, and we're working on moving them into a better way. And mainly the reason that this is difficult is that it just doesn't allow for consistency of the content editor's experience. So when you're trying to keep in mind all of these things that we've just mentioned, right, which is a lot, alt text and tags and image titling and all these things, and using your right hierarchy. When you're using everything within a WYSIWYG editor that's sort of unstructured, it becomes very hard to keep a consistent experience, and it just creates more work for people. So what we try to do and what we're implementing on the site for NDSU is this sort of more structured content, which is something Drupal is really good at. We can build out these pages from the admin's perspective that give you a very structured layout of here's where you're going to put your heading, and we're automatically going to style that heading for you to the appropriate tag. Here's your description. WYSIWYG editor is where the field where you're going to enter your description. On the CTA, please name your URL. And some, we'll often put this kind of reminder text down underneath fields to say, write something intuitive that people will understand what you're linking to, or on an image upload field, please, describe the image in this upload. So that really helps kind of create this governance around the content and something that really helps folks as we build. So just a few points to keep in mind, and this is certainly true for NDSU. They are a success story, but it's a work in progress. They haven't implemented all the things that we discussed so far. The examples they have, but certainly all of the things that we found in our audit. It's an ongoing practice, and it's something that we're partnering with them for the long term to work with them, and they're checking Siteimprove along with us to make sure that these things are continuing happening on their website, and we're constantly making strides for improvement. It's a journey, and as you embark on that journey, you're going to run into obstacles, and there are going to be things that are easier to check off the list and others that aren't. And it's important to make sure that that's your frame of mind going into this, and to continue to think of it as something that is evolving. Something we recommend to clients strongly is to create an editorial style guide. So again, for that consistency of experience, when you create an editorial style guide, you're creating standards to make sure that the content that you create across the various content editors, if you have a large team, or even as a small team, some folks may have more experience with building an accessible website than others. And so it's really important to be able to have something that is a shared understanding that you can reference together to build towards the accessible standard that you're looking to achieve. We also really recommend that clients use Siteimprove. So while we use it in our audit process, NDSU also has a subscription to Siteimprove and can see their dashboard. There's folks on NDSU's team that are constantly checking that and using that as a checklist to go through and continue to validate the work that they're doing on the accessibility side on an ongoing basis. So Siteimprove is just an always great tool to have as you continue to embark on your accessibility journey. And so with that, I'm really excited to hand it over to Laura McDaniel from NDSU, our wonderful client, who is a superstar for taking on a project of this size and complexity. And we thought that you might benefit a little bit from hearing about things from her perspective and the journey that it took her to get here, working with these partners. So Laura, take it away.
All right, thanks, Nelson. Good morning, everyone. I will first explain my goofy image on the slide and then give you just a quick overview of how I see this project. This was a first draft of the inaugural cover of our magazine that we launched about 20 years ago. And it's sort of my example experience of, when you're suddenly handed an enormous task and your team isn't really built for it, you start where you start and you figure out what your priorities are and then you go. And I'm happy to report that the magazine did develop into a very strong communication piece for our university. And the cover did not look like this. Same thing with this web project. We're a very, very small team and all of us wear many, many hats. So we didn't have any specialists, we just had to take the task and prioritize what we needed to focus on. And certainly accessibility was at the top of that list, both because, as has been mentioned, the high percentage of users who have a disability, 1 in 4 is really high, but I would also suggest that many of us who don't technically meet that, I've kind of become one of the tests for just I'll call it aging vision. And I also have always believed that accessible design is also good design. And so those dovetail really nicely for our philosophical approach. But again, since we're a teeny tiny team and we didn't have any specialists, we really needed to rely on external support. And so this has been, Siteimprove is a very helpful tool and is something that we use on a regular basis to help us maintain our commitment to accessibility. And I think a lot of you will relate to the concept of your campus people not always appreciating the trade-offs that you go through to have that clarity of design and the accessibility for all your users. So it's kind of an ongoing education process as well. So that's sort of my quick overview of how we use the products and how we continue to keep at it, I guess is what I'll call it. And so I'll leave it alone, and then during the discussion, if you have any more specific questions about how we approached, I'll be happy to answer them.
Great, thank you for sharing that. I know that it's been a large task to undertake, and I think, yeah, please ask your questions to Laura and to all of us at the end about just how that journey sort of takes shape and what are some of the steps that you can start. So then just to quickly touch on working with partners in this process. And some of you may be in a place where you're looking to work with a partner. Some of you may be in a place where this is something you're just feeling out and trying to figure out how to start, or you've got a big internal team and you know that you can take this on internally. But from our perspective, a lot of what we try to focus on as a partner and what I think value that a partner can bring to the table is, again, that balance between what is going to meet the letter of the law from the perspective of accessibility and what is going to meet the aspirations of the visual design of the website, the functionality of the website, and some of these non-negotiables that you may have about about what you want your website to do and look like and feel like. So as a team that's well versed in accessibility and does this all the time and sees a lot of use cases, different websites, we can usually come to the table with unique ideas about how to take this on and where you can balance those priorities. We can be proactive, and we can also, when you're looking to build a website, we can come in and build it with accessibility best practices in mind to give you a blueprint, or even when we're in an audit situation like this one, to say this is a best practice starting point. Again, it ultimately comes down to how that is maintained over time. And so working with a partner like Siteimprove and like Acquia to give you a great platform to build the website on is really helpful, as they can help as well from other perspectives, from the checking of this, with Siteimprove's tools on a regular ongoing basis. So if you're looking for information about how to work with a partner, please let us know. So with that, we'll talk about some takeaways here. So again, it's a balance is a big takeaway. I know I've kind of beaten that one to death, but everybody's got a different project and a different set of needs organizationally. So keep that in mind and focus on the quick wins that you can achieve first, and then kind of work on the rest as you go. And then, again, as we've said a lot through this presentation, accessible design is just good design. It's not always just for folks who have what you would really consider a disability. You have to keep in mind that there's context, here as well. I'm sure we've all been in a situation where we're looking at a website on our mobile phone, and there's glare from the sun or something like that, and it's difficult to see contrast in those situations. So regardless of whether or not your user has a disability, it's good for people in different contexts. It's good for SEO, and it's just good best practice. And then I know Kevin wanted to take this last takeaway.
Yeah, thanks, Nelson. To add on to what Laura and Nelson had alluded to earlier, accessibility is really an ongoing practice. It's something that you're going to be constantly striving for and improving on. As Laura had mentioned, their team is still monitoring the site through Siteimprove, so it's never a place where you can just arrive. It's a process and not a project.
So with that, we'd love to take your questions. In addition to myself, Kevin, David being here, and of course Laura, to ask questions about sort of the experience from the client side, I've also brought Megan Hack along, who is one of our technical senior engineers who is actually directly involved in this project from a technical perspective. So as questions come in from the Q&A that are more about tactical things from an accessibility standpoint, Megan's going to be a great person to help answer those questions. So we'd love to hear what you have to say.
Excellent. This is David. I can moderate some questions. I have some questions of my own, and we also have some user-submitted questions, and I'll walk through some of those over the next few minutes. I'd like to start with Laura at NDSU. We heard that a project like this is not just a project; it's an ongoing journey. Many of our attendees today may be wondering how to jumpstart something like this inside their own organizations, whether it's a compliance issue or other driver. What drove you to start this project, and how do you gain momentum inside the organization to make this a priority?
In our case, it's not probably a very helpful comparison, but I'll tell it and you can maybe follow up. We had not updated our website in far too long, and so it became a crisis in terms of the campus in understanding of it, but it was a cost issue and a capacity issue with our designers and our technical people. So we kind of reached a crisis point, and so we dove into the deep end of boiling water and tried to do as much as we can as quickly as we could. I would not recommend that to anyone. But the important thing was that we once we got to the point where we were going to invest, we did some good research and found some best practices. We had been using Siteimprove even for our very dated site all along, because that accessibility issue for especially those top pages was something that we had already prioritized. So in our case, it's not a very good example, but I'm guessing that it's common in higher ed to have sort of a fever break and then you dive in.
Mm-hmm. And how do you keep going? How do you ensure accessibility is an ongoing practice? And I'll ask that of you, Laura, but also Kevin and Nelson. Love to hear from your professional backgrounds how accessibility as a practice is something that keeps going inside of organizations.
You know, for us, it's just really been a given. We're not willing to not serve our audiences in that way, and we believe that good accessible design is good visual appeal, a good message for our brand. So they really go hand in hand. So it's just never a question. It's a commitment that's built into our approach.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah, David, just to expand on that a little bit, I really think it needs to be an organization as a whole needs to take an approach that it's top down. So the management team, higher ups, all need to be bought into this. And a big thing for ongoing, I think, is continuous training and monitoring, similar to what Siteimprove is going to provide you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. From the partner perspective, I think it's super important that you designate someone who is sort of going to be the champion of this stuff. And it does have to come from leadership. There has to be buy-in for these things and a priority about it. And then in the editorial workflow, as you're working on the site on a day-to-day basis, you know, you get busy and it's easy to let things slide. But if you are able to designate someone who's really in charge of keeping that stuff up and checking on those things, and as well, if you can build your CMS in such a way as Drupal allows you to on Acquia's platform, where you can create a scalable solution that gives you these content sort of guardrails and guidelines and gives you reminders and you know, structures your content in a way that you can maintain accessibility without having to think about it as much. It sort of takes some of that really intense strain and effort off of the day-to-day team.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of Drupal, I'll point the question right back at you, and I'm triaging some questions coming in fast and furious from our audience. Can you speak a little bit on the ARIA standard and how Drupal 8 adheres to the specification, whether it adheres out of the box or what it takes to make it work?
Megan, I think that might be a great question for you to answer if you don't mind.
And the question is, regarding the ARIA specification, how does Drupal 8 adhere to the specification? Does it, and how does it work if it does out of the box? And if we don't have specific answers and we don't get to all of our questions, we'll try and provide written responses to the audience post-event.
Yeah, is Megan, are you able to, are you on mute perhaps? No, I can't hear her. I don't know if.
Can you hear me now?
Oh yes, there she is.
All right, there we go.
Hey,
I'm sorry.
Wouldn't be a webinar without some technical difficulties, right?
To bring in the technical person to have the technical difficulties. Sorry about that. Happy to answer this question. So Drupal 8 does comply, and I think it's important to note that NDSU is, far from being an out-of-the-box Drupal 8 solution. When it came to us, one of the things we were auditing was, were the landmarks in place? What were the landmarks that were being used? Were the proper labels in place? And it's a fairly complicated site. It's not just a matter of determining regions in each page or in each template, but also we're using paragraphs, and how do those get templated, and what does the markup look like for those? And so, I think that's been mentioned a number of times that this is an ongoing process, and it certainly is from this perspective as well, that when we did the audit, let's get a high level view of what we can do to meet the guidelines for ARIA specifically, which, if you know anything about it, just a quick description is that it's aimed at giving more meaning and operability to more complicated web markup type things. Like once you have widgets and things that use JavaScript and AJAX, how do we maintain accessibility with keyboards on entities like that? So again, we did sort of a high level audit of what was there. We went through and had, sort of prioritized what we knew we could move forward with fixing. And then we also sort of looked to the future of what other things are gonna, come into play in the site, and how can we make sure that those are also meeting the standard.
Excellent, thank you. I'll move to another question. Perhaps it's right to you or someone else on the call, but what was the hardest accessibility issue or requirement that had to get solved? What was the toughest thing to solve?
I think that is one of the big ones. In part, like if you have ever built anything with paragraphs in Drupal, it gives users the ability, or editors the ability, to create multiple instances of things. And that becomes kind of a bit of a hiccup when we're trying to label things and make them understandable to people who are using a keyboard to operate through a site, and make them still be understood as individual items. So there was that. But I think another big thing was the design part of it. So Nelson showed the example of, you have this big, beautiful photo banner, and we want to have text on top, and it looks really nice without that box. And so there's this push and pull of, well, we have to make this accessible. It's not our first design choice, maybe. And so I think some of the conversations around that, and I certainly encountered it on other projects as well, where if we're trying to hit those contrast ratios, sometimes you have to give up a little bit on the design side, and that can be really difficult, and there can be difficult conversations around that. But if you kind of have this, accessibility is something that simply has to be met, then in the end those conversations work out. But
great. One of our viewers asks, in regards to the word guardrail, the word guardrail came up a number of times during today's talk. Can you give an example of a guardrail that you keep mentioning and referring to?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll start, and Megan probably has other examples as well. That's a great question. I think I'll jump back, if it's okay, to a previous slide here. Actually, let me see if I can jump without having to scroll through each one. But so this page, right, is the back end of Drupal, the actual admin view of Drupal. You can see here in this heading field that's at the top, this is what I would consider to be a guardrail, or the CTA, where it says URL, and then you actually have you link a URL. It says Explore NDSU 56 there. That's just linking to an internal page. But if you were linking off to another website, you would have a place for a URL, and then you have link text. And so what these fields do as sort of what we call structured content, or as I keep saying, guardrail, which I probably should use the real word for this, which is structured content. It allows you to not have to write this stuff in a WYSIWYG or an HTML and remember to do it. It's prompting you for that information. And so by a guardrail, I mean, it gives you that sort of like thing to bump up against and say, oh yeah, no, I remember now, I'm supposed to put in a descriptor of the link text here, or of the image. I'm going to give a description of the image here. And so that kind of helps people, as you get lots of content editors working within the same CMS, building out lots of pages, it becomes more difficult to have that governance over what are people doing to maintain accessibility. And these sort of prompts and the reminder text at the bottom helps to keep people within the lane, so to speak, for accessibility. And Megan, maybe you have better examples of that than I can think of now, but that's kind of what I mean when I say that.
I think it's a really good example. And just to take it a little bit further, into the sort of technical realm, we can use Drupal's forms to structure the content, and then we can use the ability to template what is delivered via those forms to then really structure the markup. And so I think you have, between those two things, you're guiding content editors and then displaying things the way that you really want to display them. So I think that Drupal is a really powerful tool in guiding people.
Excellent. Here's a question, maybe it's for you, Megan. I'll try and replicate the question just as it came in. So it's one thing to use accessibility checkers like Axe and Chromevox, etc., but are there any services that actually check with real-world, partially sighted or blind users? The question continues. The WCAG is a set of guidelines, but there are also issues adapting existing sites and 100% following those guidelines.
Yeah. So without knowing any specific examples of services, I'm guessing that there are. Just knowing that we use services to do other sort of usability testing, say for building menu structures and that sort of thing. I'm guessing that they're out there, but I'm sorry, I don't have an exact answer.
Okay.
The second part of the question, and I saw another question on there too that sort of got to this a little bit, is around manual testing as well. I think that one of the really nice things about Siteimprove is that it actually requires you to do manual testing, alongside giving you, very straightforward, your contrast didn't meet these guidelines sort of feedback. It also says, hey, have you actually tabbed through the site and checked these things? Because there's just a point, and I think you encounter this all the time when working in technology, is, okay, the machines can do lots of things. That's cool. But we still need to have humans take over and really check for some of those things that really only humans are ever going to see or understand. And so I think that's always got to be a big part of testing and building sites. Is I can use Siteimprove to check for lots of things, and then it's going to recommend to me all these things that humans need to check in on as well. I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind in doing this work.
Great. We have time for one last question. I'm not sure who to point this to, but I'll put it out there. Are there example editorial style guides that you point people to that are good examples of accessible style guides?
That's a great question. I don't know of any off the top of my head, but I think that's something we could dig around for and share maybe in a follow-up. Megan, do you have any off the top of your head?
I do not. I actually think that Palantir has done some blogging around it, and don't hold me to that necessarily, but I think that we have. We've done a lot of blogging around like content governance, and we may have also waded into the area of sort of like content style. I'm guessing there's a lot of resources on the web around it as well, but we could certainly do some digging.
Great. Excellent. Well, I think we're at the end of time. Maybe we can go over what you will receive from Acquia post-event. Soon you'll get, I think, a recording of the session.
Yep, recording of the webinar, the slides, and there are going to be a couple ebooks and I think a related webinar as well. You'll receive that in the next couple days.
Excellent. Well, I would like to thank each of our guests, Kevin Roddy of Siteimprove, Nelson Harris of Palantir, and Laura McDaniel of NDSU, and Megan Heck as well. You've all done a great job at answering questions, but also presenting a vision of what it's like to work and deliver a fully accessible website. So for that, thank you all for joining Acquia and our partners today for this event. We hope to see you at another future Acquia event.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.